In a forgotten valley, a broken old man lived alone. No visitors, no words, just silence and scars. One freezing morning, 7 Comanche girls collapsed at his door, fleeing something darker than the cold. He took them in without asking why. Days later, 700 warriors surrounded his cabin, and what happened next turned a loner into a legend. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The wind screamed across the snow-blanketed plains as if mourning the dead, but Elias Rourke didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't breathe any harder than necessary. He just stood in the doorway of his hand-built log cabin, one hand gripping a lantern, the other resting on the butt of a rusted shotgun, his heart long calcified by solitude, loss, and a lifetime of betrayal. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 7 years, hadn't ridden into town since the sheriff spat on his boots and told him to let the land take him. Hadn't so much as seen another face in over 2 winters, not since he buried his wife and son beneath the roots of the lone cottonwood tree out back. Not since the land turned against him and the world proved it had no use for old soldiers with broken hands and fractured hearts. But that morning, as the pale sun dragged itself across the bloodless sky, he saw them. 7 figures moving through the snow, slow and silent, shawls wrapped tight, feet raw, dresses soaked, each girl carrying something heavier than just the cold. And Elias almost shut the door, almost convinced himself they weren't real, until the tallest one stepped forward and collapsed, her knees buckling like snapped branches, and the others fell to their knees around her, too weak to cry, too numb to beg, but their eyes, God, their eyes told the story before their mouths could. And Elias, against every instinct forged in fire and grief, stepped out into the snow and lifted the girl into his arms, her skin hot with fever, bones sharp as fence wire, and for a heartbeat he was carrying his own daughter again. The one the pox took while he held her hand and swore to God he'd trade his soul for her life. But God never answered then and wouldn't now. So Elias didn't pray, didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He simply carried her in, laid her by the fire, and gestured for the rest to follow, the door slamming shut behind them like a final verdict. And in the weeks that followed, the cabin became something it hadn't been in years, alive. The girls, Comanche by blood and scarred by horror, spoke little at first, their eyes darting, hands always near blades, bodies flinching at every creak of the walls. And Elias said nothing, just fed the fire, split more wood than he needed, and watched them sleep in piles like puppies orphaned by wolves. He didn't ask what they'd been through, he didn't need to. But he saw the bruises, the burns, the way the youngest, barely 7, woke up screaming every night. The way the eldest, maybe 16, sat with her back to the wall and a sharpened stick hidden in her sleeve. It was a month before any of them spoke a word to him. And when they did, it was to ask if he'd kill them if the white men came back. And Elias only looked at her, firelight dancing in the pits of his eyes, and said, "No one takes what's under my roof," and he meant it. Because whatever part of him had died with his family had started to stir. Something primal, something paternal, and he began to teach them, not with words, but with actions. How to set traps, how to read the wind, how to find rabbit tracks under fresh snow, how to load a musket, how to tell when a man's lying by the twitch of his jaw. They taught him, too, how to laugh without guilt, how to listen without trying to fix things, how to sing lullabies in a language older than the stars. And just when the frost began to thaw and the days grew longer, just when Elias thought maybe the world would let them be, it happened. Hoofbeats in the distance, dozens of them, then hundreds, the kind that echo in your bones before they reach your ears. And Elias stepped out with his shotgun cradled in both hands, expecting bounty hunters, vigilantes, rangers maybe. But what he saw stole the air from his lungs. 700 Comanche warriors, faces painted in the colors of death and vengeance, sat silent atop their horses, weapons glinting like icicles under the midday sun. and at their head rode a man whose presence burned brighter than any fire Elias had ever built. A chief with an eagle's feathers and a jaguar's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice rolled like thunder across the clearing, asking if Elias was the one who sheltered the lost daughters of his blood, the one stolen in a raid 6 moons past. And Elias, throat dry and pulse heavy, simply nodded and stepped aside, revealing the girls behind him, now stronger, fiercer, standing like warriors beside their weathered protector. And in that moment, the entire war party dismounted in silence and knelt, not to the girls and not to Elias, but to the bond that had formed between them, a sacred thing forged not by blood but by sacrifice. And the chief rose, approached Elias, and offered a gift no man had ever given him before: respect, a place among them, a seat by their fire if he'd have it. And Elias, who had spent years trying to forget the sound of his own name, whispered, "Only if they stay too." And the chief smiled, nodded, and from that day on, the cabin was never empty again. They built more shelters, planted food together, hunted as one, sang at night beneath the stars, and Elias found himself laughing more in one season than in all his years combined. But peace is a fragile thing, and when a band of cavalrymen rode in months later, rifles drawn, demanding the return of escaped hostiles, Elias stepped forward alone, unarmed, his hair wild, beard thick, coat tattered, and told them they'd have to go through him. And when they laughed and reached for their weapons, the hills around them echoed with war cries, and in seconds, 700 warriors rose from the tall grass like a wave of vengeance, surrounding the troopers so completely they dropped their weapons before the first arrow flew. And Elias walked among them, collecting rifles like fallen branches, his silence more terrifying than any shout. And from that day on, no one dared come near their valley again. Seasons passed, and Elias grew older, slower, his hands more bone than flesh. But every time he thought death might come for him in the night, he smiled because he knew he'd be going with a full heart. And when he finally did die on a warm summer night, under a sky full of stars and laughter, he was buried not beneath the cottonwood where grief had once consumed him, but at the highest point in the valley, overlooking the cabins, the fire pits, the girls who had become leaders and mothers and legends, and the stone they placed on his grave read only, "The man who chose us," because no other words were needed. And long after settlers vanished and towns crumbled, the valley remained, guarded by the descendants of the Seven, their stories passed down not as tragedy but as truth, that sometimes the fiercest warriors wear frost on their beards and carry grief in their hearts, and sometimes the loneliest man becomes the father of a nation born from fire, blood, and shelter.